So I've come over to Australia with my children to visit Martindale Hall, and this has long been in my heart to visit because it is very much like our home. I live in a house called Dalemain, and that is in Cumbria in the Lake District. And for years and years I've known about this wonderful house built in Australia called Martindale Hall. And I wanted to see really what it was like because it has such an extraordinary connection with our own home. Welcome to Dalemain. This is the home of the Hasell family and has been for over 350 years. And I live here with my husband, Robert, who is a farmer and farms these ancient lands as all the Hasells have done before, and my three children. The fun of living at Dalemain is that it's a living and breathing place where we live as a family, but we're also open to the public, and we have a lot of people coming each year to visit the house. Actually, Dalemain has always welcomed people, always had people coming and going, living here, visiting it. And it's about sharing the house and about enjoying it together and what people bring to the house, which makes it the important place it is today. It's nothing to do with just living here in a vacuum. And I like to think it's the same at Martindale Hall, that it's gathering up all these people who love it. And the people of South Australia were given Martindale Hall in order to enjoy it and love it and see how people lived in the past, but also enjoy it today and for the future. I'd like to tell you a story about two people. It's a love story, and it's been passed down through generations of the Hasell family since the 1800s. And it revolves around someone called Edmund Bowman Jr. And he was the great-grandson of Edmund Bowman, who was the steward at Dalemain. The steward at Dalemain worked for Edward Hasell and was well trusted. He would spend money for Edward Hasell, he would acquire land and buildings, but he also actually lived in the house because Edward Hasell was an absentee landlord, and he trusted Edmund Bowman to run his estate. This is the room which I like to think Edmund Bowman Sr. slept in. It's very cosy, it's got wonderful oak panelling, ancient. It's above the medieval hall, so it was a new floor that was put in. And he and his wife would have slept here quite comfortably, I think. And in fact, it over the years hasn't changed at all. These wonderful oak floorboards and the panelling which we polish once a year. It's a beautiful room to be in. So here he was, living at the end of the 1700s at Dalemain, and his son would have grown up here. His son then decided that he should leave Cumbria and he would go and find his fortune, and he went off to Australia. The Bowmans settled in what is now Tasmania, but by 1840 they had relocated to the new colony of South Australia. Despite the distance, they retained their connection to Dalemain. Young Edmund Bowman Jr., born in 1855, was sent to Cambridge to complete his education in the mid-1870s. And so what is interesting is that he would have known and loved Dalemain through the stories that his family had told him of growing up there, of living there. And there were a lot of Bowman relations that he would have visited, and Askham, where they come from, is very close to Dalemain. And when Edmund came back to England, the great-grandson, he came up to Cumbria to see his relations who lived in Askham and all around that area, and came over to Dalemain, and he met with the family of the house, which was still Hasells, and he met one in particular, was Frances Hasell. She was the youngest daughter of a large family of Edward Hasell, and she adored Cumbria, she loved her family, and she loved being at Dalemain. And she spent a lot of time with her mother in the garden because her mother was a great gardener. This garden is such a wonderful place of peace and serenity. And I like to think that if Edmund came and met up with Frances, that they would have had time to just wander about, looking at things and enjoying the scents and aromas of a garden and the plantings. And she also loved walking in the fells and walking down to Ullswater. And she was very much at home in this place. And it is quite possible that they would have shared a great love of walking on the fells and walking in the garden. And as they did so, it is said that he fell madly in love with her. And she, I think, would probably have fallen in love with him. And when he fell in love with her, he knew he must marry her, and he knew that he must take her back to Australia. So after a while, he proposed to Frances. So he said, "Will you marry me? Will you come back to Australia? It's an amazing country. You must come and see what it's like." And she was young, and she was frightened, I think. And she said, no, I can't do that. And Edmund went back to Australia, and he decided what he should do was to build a house like Dalemain, which he could then present to Frances and say, "Come to Australia." So that is precisely what he did. He employed architects and people to help to create this incredible building, Martindale Hall. When Edmund Bowman Jr. came to visit Frances Hasell, when he visited Dalemain, what he was seeing was not just a house, not just a view, he was seeing a whole kind of lifestyle, something which encapsulated all that he was hoping to do. So he picked all the most wonderful things about Dalemain. He knew the house by now, he knew it well, and he called it Martindale Hall because that was part of the Dalemain Estate. And if you come to Dalemain in Cumbria, there's a wonderful valley called Martindale with wild deer in it. And so he was bringing Cumbria into Australia in that way too. And so he created Martindale Hall, which was almost like a perfect country house. And you can see that when he was looking for somewhere, when he decided, right, I'm going to go and build Dalemain in Australia, where shall I do it? He was looking for a very particular place. He was looking for somewhere, perhaps on a slight raise. He was looking for water. That was essential. And it wasn't just essential because he needed irrigation, it was because he actually wanted to make a lake. This lake was important in the landscaping, as indeed it is at Dalemain. And what he was doing was again transferring an idea that he'd seen here of a lake which had been created out of a river. And the Emont behind me over there was dammed, and it created a lake which you could view from the house, and exactly the same at Martindale Hall. Edmund Bowman took a lot of tradition from Dalemain and transplanted it really into South Australia. So for instance, he loved hunting, and I think he was the first person to introduce beagles into South Australia, and he would hunt. And he built a polo field, he had a cricket pitch. He also loved horses, and that is very much part of the tradition of Dalemain, where racehorses had been bred and kept and enjoyed over the centuries. And so again, he was doing that. All these things were part of what English life was about, and he was representing it in a new way in Australia and making it come to life again in a very different way. And what's interesting is that in Mintaro, there's a blacksmith there, and there was a man, an old man, who could remember when people went to visit Martindale Hall, he was quite old by this time, that he could remember the extra horses that couldn't be fitted into the wonderful stables there were brought down to the blacksmith and stabled there as extra stabling for the big house. And in Mintaro in itself is the most gorgeous village. It's absolutely beautiful. It's again quite old, it's got its own personality, and was the sort of support place for a big house. And clearly you need that. You need help. You can't run a house like that on your own. You need all sorts of people to come and help you do it. And this was a wonderful way of employing local people. That is what is so exciting. If we can save Martindale Hall, then we have something for the future for the people who live in that community, which is what, after all, that house was all about in the first place. And once he'd made this beautiful house, he then turned his thoughts to the garden and to the parkland. And so he had planted trees in the park. He had wonderful rolling parkland, just like Dalemain. The parkland at Dalemain is very, very beautiful. It's an 18th century park, and the sheep graze in it as they did 200 years ago. I like to think that what I'm looking at, what Frances Hasell was looking at in the sheep, in the parkland and the rolling hills, is what he, Edmund Bowman Jr., was trying to recreate in Australia. So much of the magic has been transported from England into this extraordinary house. He built it in a very similar vein. He used sandstone, he used beautiful wood. The hall is just staggeringly beautiful at Martindale Hall. very similar to Dalemain, made of wonderful oak trees. So one of the things that Dalemain is known for, and is very, very beautiful indeed, is all the woodwork that we have. It's all about the materials that were available at the time, and so there was a lot of oak trees and a lot of sandstone. And so those are the two things that you see at Dalemain. And the oak floors are particularly spectacular. In all the main rooms, they would have been so, so beautiful, and even today haven't moved a centimetre. They're still absolutely tight. And so we hardly dare do any changes because it would ruin it. And I think that that again has transferred itself here. It's again this very high quality, this beautiful effect, which you don't often see. You know, people have taken time and trouble to create something absolutely spectacular. I think the other thing is that actually what is lovely is that the outside comes to the inside. By using interesting woods, you've immediately related yourself to the garden and what's going on there and into the wider spaces. It's wonderful. And he created this jewel, really, which had all the heritage of this ancient house in the middle of Cumbria. And he then was returning and returned briefly to England. And we can only assume that it was to come and see Frances once more and tell her about this extraordinary thing that he had created for her. And he came to see her and he said, "I have now made a house like Dalemain. I've called it Martindale Hall. It's got rooms with bathrooms, it's got a library, it's got a billiard room for the men, it's got a marvellous dining room, marvellous drawing room, and it has everything that you could possibly desire. I have this marvellous house where you can come and live." And I'm sure she considered it. I'm sure she was very much in love with him. And she still said no. And so this sad story of this person who then, a delightful girl, remained unmarried for the rest of her life. And so Edmund Bowman left and he went back to Australia, but he had all this wonderful stuff about Dalemain which he had almost assimilated. He married very happily and they lived here in this glorious, wonderful house for at least 10 years before he sold up. We've been talking about a wonderful love story between two people, Edmund Bowman Jr. from Australia coming over and going and meeting Frances Hasell, and how wonderful that was. And some people cast doubt on that, and it's been passed down as a story through time. But what is irrefutable, in my view, is the sense of likeness that Dalemain has with Martindale Hall, the kind of building it is, the kind of inside that it is. But above all, that the name Martindale Hall comes from this estate. Martindale, the valley, sits beyond Ullswater, just up there, and is the most beautiful valley. And that was in, I think, Edmund Bowman Jr.'s heart when he decided to call Martindale Hall, this amazing valley at Dalemain. What we have with Dalemain and the estate and Martindale Hall and all the cultural history that is involved with these two houses is something so precious. We cannot let it go. It must be that Martindale Hall is saved for the people not only of South Australia but Australia itself and the world, and that we maintain this incredible connection between the two houses and grow it for the future.